My name is Father Thomas Miller. I am 54 years old. On the morning of November 14th, 2025, I was standing in the sacristy of St. Jude's in Columbus, Ohio, preparing for the 8 a.m. weekday Massachusetts. It was a cold, damp Friday. I remember the smell of damp wool from my overcoat and the stale, lingering scent of frankincense. As I reached up to pull the green chasuble over my head, a sharp, cold spike of pain drove itself directly through my sternum. It wasn't the elephant on the chest people talk about. It felt like a structural failure, as if the very frame of my body had decided it could no longer hold my weight. I tried to take a breath, but my lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand. I leaned against the heavy oak cabinet where we keep the chalices. My server, a retired postal worker named Artie, looked at me and his face went gray. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just dropped the processional cross and ran for the phone. The sound of that brass cross hitting the marble floor was the last thing I heard clearly. It was a harsh, metallic clang that seemed to echo forever. I collapsed onto my knees, my hands clawing at the lace of my alb. The pain transitioned from a spike to a crushing heat. I could feel my heart stuttering, a chaotic, fluttering mess in my chest that medical professionals call ventricular fibrillation. I knew enough to know I was dying. I wasn't thinking about heaven or my sins. I was thinking about the unfinished paperwork on my desk and the fact that I hadn't called my sister back. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, and then the lights in the room didn't dim, they sharpened. Every grain of wood in the cabinet, every scratch on the floor, became hyper-real for a split second before the world simply tilted on its axis and dumped me into the dark. I didn't feel peace yet. I felt the profound, biological terror of a creature that knows its clock has stopped. The paramedics arrived at 8:12 a.m. I know this because I was watching them from a corner of the ceiling. It is a cliché until it happens to you. I saw my own body, looking remarkably small and pale, sprawled out in those heavy liturgical robes. Artie was standing in the corner, shaking, crossing himself over and over. I wanted to tell him to stop, that it was distracting the medics, but I had no breath. I watched the lead paramedic, a woman with a tight ponytail and a name tag that read S. Miller, no relation, rip open my vestments. The sound of the fabric tearing felt more violent than the heart attack itself. V-fib, charge to 200, she shouted. I watched the paddles hit my chest. My body lurched like a landed fish, a grotesque, involuntary jump. Nothing. Again. 300. Another jolt. I felt a strange pulling sensation, like a hook caught in my navel, dragging me toward the ceiling, through the roof, and into the gray Ohio sky. But I wasn't looking at the clouds. I was looking at the city. I saw Columbus, but it looked different. It looked fragile. I saw the lines of traffic on I-71, thousands of people rushing to jobs they hated, preoccupied with grocery lists and weekend plans, completely unaware of the thinness of the veil. I saw a woman in a minivan crying while she waited for a red light. I saw a man at a bank ATM staring at a balance that clearly wasn't enough. The sheer volume of human anxiety was a physical weight, a static hum that vibrated through me. I realized then that we aren't just living our lives. We are vibrating at a frequency of collective dread. I wasn't in a tunnel of light. I was suspended over a world that felt like a glass ornament about to be dropped. The medical monitors in the ambulance below me flatlined into a single, high-pitched whine that signaled my clinical exit from the timeline of men. The transition wasn't a journey. It was a shift in focus. One moment, I was hovering over the hospital parking lot, and the next, I was standing in a place that felt more solid than earth. It wasn't a garden or a cloud. It felt like a vast, quiet hallway of a home I had forgotten I owned. The light wasn't coming from a sun. It was the atmosphere itself, and he was there. He wasn't glowing with a blinding radiance that hid his features. He looked like a man who had walked a long way to meet me. He wore a simple, dark tunic, and his hands were rough. When he looked at me, I didn't feel judged. I felt seen. It was the most uncomfortable thing I have ever experienced, to be truly known without the protection of my title or my clothes. "Thomas," he said. His voice didn't boom. It had the texture of a conversation held in a quiet room. I tried to kneel, but he stepped forward and caught my elbows, holding me upright. His grip was firm. "There is no time for that," he said, and his expression was weary, like a father looking at a storm on the horizon. "You are here because the window is closing, and those who claim to speak for me have stopped listening. They are looking at the stars for signs, but they are missing the ground beneath their feet. He turned, and the space around us changed. We weren't in the hallway anymore. We were standing on a street corner I recognized in downtown Columbus, near the State House. But the air was different. It tasted like ozone and burnt hair. The people walking past us were translucent, moving with a frantic, jerky energy. The world is holding its breath for a resolution that isn't coming, he told me. The people are waiting for a leader, a law, or a miracle to fix the ache. But I am showing you what happens before the spring. There are 5 stones that must fall before April ends. You must see them, so you can tell them that the shaking isn't the end, it's the inventory. The street corner in front of the Ohio State House began to distort, the stone pillars of the government building shimmering like heat haze. Jesus didn't point. He simply looked, and my vision followed his. I saw a man in a dark suit, someone I recognized from the local news. A mid-level state official, sitting in a parked car 2 blocks away. He was staring at a tablet screen, his face illuminated by a sickly blue light. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped the device into the footwell. The first event, Jesus said, his voice steady but heavy with a grieving sort of iron. The collapse of the secret ledger. Before March is 10 days old, a digital shadow will be lifted. It isn't a grand hack or a foreign strike, Thomas. It is a leak from within, born of spite, not justice. I watched the man in the car put his head on the steering wheel. On his screen, I saw rows of names. Names of clergy, names of judges, names of men I had shared coffee with at community fundraisers. Next to the names were numbers, transaction amounts that didn't make sense for public servants. This is the stone of exposure, he continued. It will start in a small office in the Midwest, but it will travel like a fever. People will realize that the safety nets they trusted were actually being woven into nooses. By the time the first spring rains hit, the institutional trust that holds your neighborhood together will snap. You will see it in the grocery stores first. People won't look each other in the eye because they won't know who is part of the ledger and who is a victim of it. I felt a coldness in my spirit that had nothing to do with death. I thought of my own parish, the quiet tithes, the trust the elderly put in the system. Jesus looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flash of sternness. Do not pity the institution, Thomas. Pity the people who built their houses on its sand. This must happen before April, because the ground must be cleared for what comes next. The second stone is already midair. The scene shifted instantly. I wasn't on a street corner anymore. I was standing in my own sister's kitchen in Cincinnati. The smell of pine sol and burnt toast was overwhelming. My sister, Sarah, was sitting at the table, her phone gripped in her hand. She looked 10 years older than she had at Thanksgiving. She was staring at a printed letter with a bank logo at the top. "Wait," I said, reaching out toward her, but my hand passed through the air like smoke. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Jesus stood by the refrigerator, his presence making the mundane kitchen look strangely small. The second stone is the shaking of the household. This is where it becomes personal for you, Thomas. This is the warning you will carry in your marrow. He stepped closer to the table. In late March, the grace period ends. Not just for her, but for millions. A technicality in the banking laws, a correction, they will call it, will trigger a cascade. Sarah will lose this house, not because she was lazy, but because the ledger from the first stone was balanced using her equity. I watched Sarah start to cry, not a loud, dramatic sob, but a quiet, rhythmic shaking of her shoulders that broke my heart more than any scream. I felt a surge of anger. Why are you showing me this if I can't stop it? If I'm dead, or if I'm going back, what am I supposed to do with her pain? "You are seeing the price of silence," he said. His voice was no longer soft. It was resonant, vibrating the very floorboards of the kitchen. The church stayed silent while the ledgers were cooked. The shepherds watched the wolves by the pasture. Now, the flock loses the fold. This is the personal weight. Before April, you will have to choose. Do you comfort the institution that failed her, or do you stand in the ruins with her? Your bank account will be frozen alongside hers. Your rectory will be questioned. The institutional father will become a brother in poverty. This is the only way the heart returns to the source. The kitchen dissolved into the interior of a church. Not mine, but a massive, modern cathedral with glass ceilings and state-of-the-art sound systems. It was a Sunday morning, late March. I could see the date on a digital bulletin board near the entrance. March 22nd, 2026. The pews were packed, but the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, oily tension. The third event, Jesus whispered. The great muting. I looked at the pulpit. A man was speaking, his mouth moving, his gestures practiced and professional, but no sound was coming out. I looked at the congregation. They were leaning forward, desperate, some with tears streaming down their faces, but they were hearing nothing. It wasn't a technical failure of the microphones. It was as if the air itself was refusing to carry his words. The Spirit is departing the structures of convenience, Jesus explained. Across the world, in the last weeks of March, this sermon will fail. The words will turn to ash in the mouths of those who refuse to speak of the first 2 stones. The people will come for bread, and they will be given a lecture on mindfulness or civic duty, while their homes are being taken and their leaders are being exposed. This is the event that will scatter the sheep. I saw a woman in the 3rd row stand up and walk out, her face a mask of cold fury. Then a young couple followed. Then a dozen more. They weren't leaving God, they were leaving the theater. By April, Jesus said, the largest churches will be the quietest. The power will move to the living rooms, to the street corners, to the places where the ledger cannot reach. This is the 3rd falling stone, the end of the professional mediator. You, Thomas, will stand in your own pulpit and find it empty of everything but the smell of your own fear. You will have to decide if you have anything to say when the script is gone. He turned to me, and the light in the room began to pulse with an urgency that made my phantom chest ache. The 4th stone is the one that changes the map. The cathedral didn't just fade, it disintegrated. The glass ceiling didn't break. It evaporated into a sky that was the color of a bruised plum. Jesus led me through a wall that wasn't there, and suddenly we were standing in a data center. The hum was deafening, a high-frequency scream of cooling fans and blinking server racks. This was the heart of the world's nervous system. The 4th event, Jesus said, his voice cutting through the mechanical roar like a bell. The severing of the digital cord. In the first week of April, the architecture of your togetherness will fail. It will not be a solar flare or a war, Thomas. It will be an intentional quiet. The platforms that sold you connection will become the platforms of surveillance, and then they will simply go dark. I saw a technician in a labeled fleece vest staring at a monitor. A map of the United States was turning from green to a pulsing, angry red. Why? I shouted over the noise. Because a lie cannot be sustained once the ledger is exposed, he replied. The 4th stone is the loss of the viral. When the screens go dark for those 72 hours in early April, the panic will not be about the lack of information. It will be the sudden, terrifying silence of being alone with one's own soul. People have forgotten how to hear me because they are addicted to the hum. By the time the lights come back, the world will have changed its primary language from broadcasting to whispering. Only those who know the sound of my voice in the quiet will keep their footing. He touched a server rack, and the humming stopped instantly. The silence was more violent than the noise. I felt a phantom vibration in my pocket, the muscle memory of a cell phone that wasn't there. It was a physical withdrawal, a realization that without the digital tether, I didn't know how to reach my parishioners, my sister, or the world. The 4th stone, Jesus whispered in the new dark, is the death of the distraction. The darkness of the data center didn't lift. It condensed into a singular, glowing point of light that expanded until we were standing on a high, grassy ridge overlooking a valley. The air was sweet here, smelling of damp earth and coming rain. But the horizon was flickering with a strange, rhythmic light, like a heartbeat. The 5th event, Jesus said, is the movement of the remnant. By the end of April, the 4 stones will have cleared the path. The exposure, the personal loss, the silent pulpits, and the digital dark will have stripped the world of its masks. And then, Thomas, the 5th stone falls, the convergence. I looked down into the valley. I saw small groups of people, 5s, 10s, dozens, walking along the roads. They weren't carrying signs. They weren't shouting. They were carrying bread, blankets, and Bibles. They were moving toward one another with a gravity that felt celestial. This is the outcome, he said, turning to face me fully. His eyes were no longer weary. They were burning with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. The title of the warning is 5 Events Before April, because by May, the world will be divided into 2 camps. Those who are terrified because their systems died, and those who are at peace because they found their neighbor. The 5th event is the sudden, irreversible realization that the church is not a building you go to, but a life you share. This will happen across the globe simultaneously. It is the great reset of the heart. It is the moment the wheat and the tares are finally, undeniably distinguishable by their fruit, not their words. He stepped closer, and I felt the heat of his presence. You are being sent back because you are one of the stewards of the transition. You will lose your status. You will lose your comfort. You will be mocked by those who still cling to the ledger. But you will have the bread. Tell them, April is not the end. It is the birth. The ridge began to tremble, not like an earthquake, but like a heart beginning to beat again. The vision of the valley started to blur, but Jesus held my gaze, pinning me to the moment. Before you return, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency, you must understand the price. You saw Sarah's house. You saw the silent pulpit. To carry this message, you must accept that you cannot save the structure. You will be tempted to use your position to fix the ledger or restore the digital cord. You will want to give the people back their comfort. I felt a wave of resistance. I thought of my comfortable rectory, my pension, the respect of my peers. I thought of the safety of being Father Miller instead of just Thomas. If you choose to return and speak, Jesus warned, you will be an outcast in your own house. You will watch the stones fall, and you will have to stand still while they crush the things you spent 30 years building. You will have to look at the woman in the third row and tell her that her bank account is gone, but her soul is finally free. Can you do that, Thomas? Can you love them enough to let the world they know burn down? The choice felt like a physical weight in my chest, a second heart attack, but this one was spiritual. I looked at his rough hands, the hands of a carpenter who knew that sometimes you have to tear out the rot before you can frame the room. I realized that my fear wasn't for the people, it was for my own relevance. I looked at him and whispered, yes. As the word left my lips, the valley, the ridge, and the presence began to spin into a vortex of white light. The silence of the data center returned for a split second, followed by a sudden, jarring sound, the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator. The transition back into my body was not a gentle descent. It was a physical assault. It felt like being slammed into a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small and made of cold lead. My eyes snapped open to the harsh, fluorescent glare of an ICU ceiling. The smell hit me first, that sterile, chemical cocktail of floor wax and antiseptic that defines a hospital. I could feel a plastic tube down my throat, a rhythmic, mechanical pumping that was doing the breathing I had forgotten how to do. A monitor to my left was chirping with an aggressive, steady rhythm. My heart rate was 114 beats per minute. A nurse with tired eyes and a blue scrub cap leaned over me. Father Miller? Thomas, stay with us. You're in Riverside Methodist. You've had a major cardiac event. I tried to speak, but the ventilator blocked the words, leaving me with only a desperate, raspy gag. I wanted to grab her arm and tell her about the ledger. I wanted to tell her that the major event wasn't my heart, it was the calendar. It was November 16th, 2025. I had been gone for nearly 48 hours. As the sedation began to wear off, the weight of the 5 stones settled into my chest, heavier than the physical pain of the bypass surgery they had performed. I lay there, trapped in the silence of the recovery wing, watching the digital clock on the wall. Every minute that ticked by felt like a countdown. The doctor, a man named Dr. Aris with a clipped, professional tone, came in that evening. He spoke about stents, ejection fractions, and lifestyle modifications. He told me I was lucky to be alive. I looked at his hands, the same hands that had likely saved my life, and I saw the translucent energy Jesus had shown me. He was worried about his malpractice insurance. He was worried about a merger between hospital networks. He was part of the system that was about to be weighed. I tried to lift my hand to bless him, but I was too weak. I realized then that my return wasn't a gift of life. It was an assignment of witness. I was a man living in the before, carrying the after in my lungs. By mid-December, I was back in the rectory, though I wasn't allowed to celebrate Mass yet. The recovery was slow, marked by a constant, dull ache under my ribs where they had cracked me open. I spent my days in the small office, the one with the unfinished paperwork I had worried about while I was dying. It felt meaningless now. I sat there staring at the parish account. Seeing the names of the donors, the ledger of our little world. The first confirmation happened on a Tuesday morning, January 13th, 2026. I was sitting in the common room with Artie, who was bringing me some tea. He had his phone out, scrolling through the news. Suddenly, he stopped. "Father, look at this. It's some kind of leak." I leaned over. The headline on a major independent news site read, "The Buckeye Files. Anonymous data dump exposes decade of shadow transactions in Ohio public offices." My heart skipped a beat, not the chaotic flutter of the attack, but the cold realization of the prophecy. I watched the screen as names began to scroll by. It wasn't just politicians. It was a list of private consultants, developers, and, my stomach turned, 3 prominent regional charitable foundations. "They're saying it's an internal leak from the state auditor's office," Artie whispered, his voice shaking. A whistleblower who didn't even want money, just wanted to burn it all down. I looked out the window at the gray Columbus sky. It was exactly as he had said. It wasn't a foreign hack. It was a domestic fracture. Within 48 hours, the local news was a storm of unexplained discrepancies. People I had known for years were being escorted out of buildings in handcuffs. The institutional trust wasn't just leaking. The dam had burst. I went to my computer and checked the parish savings account. There was a notification: account access temporarily restricted due to regional financial audit. The ledger was being balanced, and the first stone had officially hit the ground. I felt a surge of terror, not for the money, but for the fact that every word I had heard in that hallway was coming to pass with mathematical precision. The final proof, the event that stripped away my last shred of doubt, arrived in the mail on February 19th, 2026. It was a cold, bitter day, and the heating in the rectory was struggling to keep up. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the mail came. Among the bills and the flyers was a handwritten envelope from my sister, Sarah. I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper and a copy of a legal notice. The notice was a notice of accelerated foreclosure. The bank was invoking a stability clause that allowed them to recall the loan due to the regional financial crisis, the correction Jesus had described in her kitchen. "Thomas," she wrote, "I don't understand. I've never missed a payment. They said the funds in my escrow were unverifiable because of the ledger scandal. They're giving me 30 days. I'm scared, Tom. I'm so scared. Everything feels like it's slipping away. Why is this happening?" I stared at the letter. This was the personal fracture. This was the moment the warning became my own flesh and blood. I looked at the kitchen clock. It was 10:15 a.m. I looked at the calendar. We were weeks away from April. The silent pulpits were next. The digital dark was coming. I felt a profound, crushing loneliness, standing in a house that was technically no longer mine, holding the grief of a sister I couldn't financially save. I walked over to the small crucifix hanging over the stove. I didn't pray for a miracle. I didn't ask for the money to appear. I simply touched the wood and whispered, "I'm telling them today." I went to my desk, picked up a pen, and began to write the sermon for the coming Sunday, the one I knew would be my last. I wrote about the stones. I wrote about the 5 events. And I wrote about the bread we would have to share when the buildings were gone. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the sidewalk where the people would soon be walking toward a silence they weren't prepared for. I could still feel the faint, rhythmic hum of the ventilator in the back of my throat, a reminder that I was only here on borrowed breath, to speak until the air went thin. I picked up my phone to call Sarah. The screen flickered, the signal bar dropped to a single, pulsing dot, and then the screen went black.